Richard E. Byrd, first to blaze an air route to the North Pole, prepares for a similar flight over the bottom of the Earth.
For 77 years, the truth about Admiral Richard E. Byrd's Antarctic expeditions lay frozen, locked away in military archives and in the mind of one man. Now, before his death, the last survivor has spoken.
Admiral Byrd tells an extraordinary story.
Most valuable, important place left in the world for science.
What he revealed is more than history. It's a secret that could rewrite everything we know about Earth. Why was Operation Highjump armed like an invasion? What vanished team was never recorded in official logs? And what did Admiral Byrd himself admit to seeing beneath the ice? We'll uncover what Robert Johnson took nearly 8 decades to say, and why governments wanted it buried. The making of a legend. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, Jr. was not just another name in the annals of exploration. He was a man whose very life seemed pulled from the pages of an epic adventure novel. Born in 1888 into a prominent Virginia family, Byrd was destined for a life of distinction. From the moment he joined the U.S. Navy, his career was marked by daring feats and a relentless drive to be the first at everything. His peers respected him, his superiors trusted him, and the public adored him. With piercing blue eyes and a charisma that made headlines, Byrd was more than an officer. He was a living symbol of American ambition. Byrd's reputation was cemented early on with a series of bold aerial achievements. In 1926, he claimed to be the first person to fly over the North Pole, an accomplishment that made him a household name and earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor. He followed that with record-breaking flights across the Atlantic and to the South Pole, becoming the first to navigate the planet's most inhospitable frontiers from the sky. New York City gave him not one, but 3 ticker-tape parades in his honor, an honor few could dream of, let alone achieve. That craving for exploration was more than glory quests. Every one of those voyages would become, for Byrd, a challenge involving human limits, and another opportunity to go where no man has gone before. While others regarded the frozen poles as deserted wastelands, Byrd viewed them as blank pages awaiting the ink and brush of history to fill them in. This desire to chart the uncharted would bring him back to Antarctica over and over again, to ever bolder and more secret missions. Byrd's first expedition to Antarctica, in 1928, was one of stupendous success. The team set up the little American base along the Ross Ice Shelf, had done extensive aerial mapping, and with some flavor touched upon the huge, untouched potential of the continent. His next major expedition to Antarctica was in 1933, which literally went a step bolder when he decided to spend 5 months alone in a remote meteorological station, cut off from the harshest conditions on Earth, temperatures far below zero, and almost lost his own life due to carbon monoxide poisoning. This brush with death hasn't slowed him. Rather, it sharpened his resolve. But underneath all that brave explorer kind of bravado, one individual was aware that some discoveries were far too great or far too dangerous to be made known to the world. Whispers had begun presenting themselves in naval circles by the later part of the 30s that Byrd's Antarctic trips were not merely for the purpose of mapping ice and studying weather. There seemed to be strange formations of navigation anomalies and geological wonders that simply could not have any sane explanation. None of these made it into official press releases, but they were intriguing enough to draw in the U.S. government. It was in 1939, just before another Antarctic undertaking, that Lieutenant Byrd met 19-year-old Robert Johnson. Johnson, a Sea Scout from San Diego, thought that he was offering his services for what would be a simple scientific expedition. The meeting was being held at a naval facility in Norfolk, Virginia. Johnson had expected questions about his sailing experience or technical knowledge. Byrd took one look at him and started asking strange questions. Could he keep a secret? Was he absolutely loyal to the United States? In that dimly lit room, Johnson sensed that something more was going on than just the usual trip to Antarctica. Byrd needed no noisy adventurers. He needed quiet, reliable men who would follow orders and never talk of what they saw. Johnson's calmness and self-possession distinguished him as different from other volunteers, most of whom boasted about their past glories. Without a show, Byrd picked him out of the group. What Johnson did not know was that he had crossed onto the path that would tie him to one of the most mysterious expeditions of all time. He would witness events he would never be able to divulge for nearly 80 years. At that time, he was just a young man honored to work alongside a living history, but soon would find that glory and discovery were only part of the tale in Antarctica. Johnson didn't yet know it, but his loyalty would make him a witness to events no history book would dare print. The frozen chessboard. To most people in the 1940s, Antarctica was little more than a blank spot at the bottom of the map, an endless sheet of white, home only to penguins, seals, and howling winds. But to world powers teetering on the edge of the Cold War, it was something else entirely. A colossal chessboard where the stakes weren't just land, but global dominance. Beneath that ice, scientists suspected, were vast mineral deposits, coal, oil, even uranium, that could power nations for centuries. Whoever controlled Antarctica wouldn't just hold bragging rights, they could hold the keys to the future. By the time Robert Johnson set foot there with Admiral Byrd, Antarctica had become a silent prize in an undeclared race. It was larger than the United States and Mexico combined, with no government, no borders, and no legal claims recognized by the world. The great powers knew this could change overnight. All it would take was a permanent base, a flag in the snow, and a few months of occupation to tilt the balance of power. The public image of Antarctic exploration was clean, almost romantic. Brave men braving the cold for the sake of science. Newspapers printed photos of grinning sailors beside penguins or pilots posing in front of their ski-equipped planes. But behind that, propaganda was a very different reality. Nations weren't just measuring wind speeds, they were mapping potential runways, scouting supply routes, and quietly marking areas rich in resources. Johnson would later remember how, even in those early days, the Antarctic landscape was stubborn beyond bounds. Compasses spun in lazy circles failing to point north. Radio signals sometimes vanished into static before coming back as though nothing had happened. The ice itself was eerie. In some places, it was not quite pure white, streaked very lightly, and shimmers like a pearl catching light, and it sometimes looked as if it glowed from the inside. Such would be pretty susceptible to scientific explanation: magnetic interference, atmospheric effects. But the other ones, as Johnson insisted, defied explanation. One flight was characterized by the aurora australis, the southern lights, spiriting its patterns almost as if deliberately, as they contorted shapes that would last far longer than any light could within natural bounds. Old guys who had spent too long out in the field would mutter sometimes that the lights were watching them. That was the kind of talk that officers discouraged, yet never quite managed to stamp out. Byrd himself would rarely comment on such peculiarities, at least not in public, but Johnson noted how sharply the Admiral paid attention whenever such oddities were reported. More than once, Byrd discreetly altered a flight plan or directed a ground crew to survey the area for unusual readings. These diversions were never explained, and the official logs would sometimes differ from what the men recalled doing. The terrain added to their sense of discomfort. Standing out as jagged teeth from the flat ice, Antarctica's mountains found their birth from naked rock, almost black, threatening to cut into the white skyline. Some slopes were utterly devoid of snow, revealing dark stone even at temperatures well below freezing. There were murmurings, according to Johnson, that the exposed areas were, in fact, not entirely natural and had been formed by something from beneath the ice pushing upward. One day, Johnson was on a supply trip. Somewhere he saw something that would stay with him for decades. A huge crack in the ice, too deep to even see the bottom. Warm air, gushing out, curled in pale mist into a bitter cold. He stood at the edge, feeling the faintest vibration, almost like the hum of distant machinery. Nothing in his training had prepared him for that. But little did he know that these bizarre readings and strange geological peculiarities and unexplained phenomena were all quietly recorded, classified, and sent back to Washington. For the men who were there, it was disconcerting. For the strategists sitting far out of reach, it was a riddle and maybe an opportunity. Antarctica was no longer just a frozen wilderness. Rather, it was a contested area in the shadowy struggle for global power, where science walks hand in hand with secrecy. And for this game, Admiral Byrd and his crew were American pieces on the global chessboard. Strange lights and broken compasses were only the beginning. Soon, the U.S. Navy would return with overwhelming force. Operation Highjump. In the winter of 1946, the United States launched what would become the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Officially, it was called Operation Highjump, a training exercise designed to test men and machines in extreme cold, map uncharted coastline, and practice resupply operations in hostile environments. That was the version given to the press. But for those who saw the operation up close, the scale alone suggested something far beyond scientific research. Highjump's numbers were staggering. 14 ships, including an aircraft carrier and destroyers, 33 aircraft, more than 4,700 personnel, tanks, tracked vehicles, and enough weapons to outfit a small invasion force. You don't send that kind of firepower just to count penguins. To the men aboard, it felt less like a research trip and more like the opening move in a military campaign. Once again, Robert Johnson, who is in his 20s now, has been called up to serve under Admiral Byrd. From the moment he set foot on board, he knew the tread was different. One felt the place had a disciplining quality, almost brittle, as if everyone understood that the mischief extended beyond the mission. The orders were adamant, the movements tracked, and the crew seemed to breathe with a quiet readiness. They seemed to await contact with something or someone. The rumors started even before they arrived at the ice. Whispers about Nazi activity in Antarctica had swirled since the end of the war. German vessels had slipped south, it was alleged, in the last months of 1945 on the way to a hidden base in the polar wilderness. There was talk in the intelligence briefs about geothermal oases out in the open water, and warmth within a ice that could harbor entire facilities. Johnson did not know what to believe or who could be believed, but he knew the Navy was not taking chances. Once the fleet was established in Antarctic waters, the mission activity had two layers. First were the public and recorded activities, such as mapping runs and weather studies, and then there were a few operations that were a little quieter in nature. Some of these assignments were given in person by senior officers, bypassing normal communication channels. Johnson noticed that some aircraft would take off on unexplained missions not scheduled on the day's flight plan and would come back hours later with crews who neither confirmed nor denied what had been observed. By mid-expedition, there had been such an instruction to Johnson's unit to deploy to support the ground team heading toward the mountainous region marked unstable in earlier surveys. The snow melted in distinctly patterned shapes, almost in regular patterns. It almost seemed as if something beneath the surface was radiating heat. Johnson has never forgotten that moment when the men loaded their gear. There was no fear, really, he recalled, just that they were aware they were stepping into the unknown. The team never came back at all. Officially, they were lost due to a crevasse collapse during deteriorating weather, but Johnson knew the weather had been clear that day. The story didn't match up to what those on the ground had seen, or rather, what little they were allowed to see. Almost immediately afterward, the mood on the ships changed. Reports increased, and all but some designated areas were placed off limits, without explanation. Then, as if out of the blue, Operation Highjump ended. What was to be a 6 to 8 month mission continued not much over 8 weeks. Extreme weather and exhaustion of resources were the public explanation. But February is the height of summer in Antarctica, precisely the kind of conditions under which the exercise was to have operated. Before the last withdrawal, Johnson had caught bits and pieces of conversations where officers spoke in hushed tones, words like engagement, contact, and hostile. Byrd appeared a changed man. He was quieter, heavier, as though weighed down. Johnson later recalled one night in particular. The Admiral had blocked his passage in a dimly lit corridor and imparted quietly, "We saw something. Out there we weren't supposed to." That loss was only one mystery. What Byrd saw on a separate flight would remain hidden for decades. The 3 missing hours. There's a strange gap in the record of Operation Highjump, a gap that has haunted historians, conspiracy theorists, and even a few surviving veterans for decades. It wasn't a missing day, or even half a day. It was exactly 3 hours. 3 hours in which the most decorated polar explorer in history, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, vanished from radio contact during a routine flight. The official explanation was, well, there wasn't much of one. The logs for that day list his takeoff and his return, but the middle is an empty stretch of silence. For 3 hours, there was no word from Byrd, no location updates, no telemetry. It was as if the aircraft had been swallowed whole by the white wilderness. For years, that blank space was just a curiosity. Then a document began circulating, what some claim was Byrd's own private diary. In it, the Admiral describes flying over a lush green valley, its slopes covered in forest, with rivers winding through the land. In Antarctica? In the middle of summer? Yes, but still a place where no trees should exist, no running water, no signs of warmth. It's an entry from his diary. All his instruments screeched. Compass needles twirled. Gyroscopes just went dead. The sun was no longer visible. And then he happened on movement underneath. Enormous creatures of shaggy fur and deeply curving tusks, as if from the Ice Age. Mammoths. His altitude was dropped to 1,000 feet in order to see better. But what followed was more unusual. Before him lay a city, an impossible city, glowing with what appeared to be crystalline structures and rainbow light. Then there were the aerial vehicles, the sleek disc-shaped crafts gliding at unearthly speeds alongside him instead of 1940 propeller-driven planes. They carried strange markings. Some said they were swastikas. Others said they were unknown symbols. Either way, they maneuvered with a precision no plane of his time could match. According to the diary, not his own voice came over the radio and not from the carrier ship. It spoke in English, but with an apparently different accent. "Fear not," it commanded. "Follow us and prepare to land." He fought against it, yet his plane was no longer responding. The ship just descended on its own towards the city filled with shimmering lights. The next part in the diary is the one that blurs the line between historical record and legend. Byrd stated he was met by tall, blond, pale men who led him into a hall with walls of crystal. There, the master, was said to have warned him about the threatening path of mankind after having bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The warning was to stop or be destroyed when it became too late. They have scrapped the diary as a made-up one. There's no strong evidence that it was written in Byrd's hand, and it does veer toward being theatrical in its style. But shreds of what was said in the account find a congruence with what Robert Johnson would later, never mentioning things like luscious valleys or crystal cities, say, Johnson remembered Byrd coming back from a solo flight utterly shaken, refusing to say what his exact flight path was. He remembered that very same day being pulled aside for an extra security detail around an area of the ice marked restricted, and he recognized the whispers of an off-limits place Byrd had visited that wasn't on any official map. Johnson's own unrecorded missions would reveal structures that weren't supposed to exist, structures someone destroyed within days. The mission within the mission. Not long after Admiral Byrd's unexplained 3-hour flight, Robert Johnson received orders unlike any he'd gotten before. They didn't come through the normal chain of command. There was no written record, no inclusion on the daily assignment sheet. Instead, an officer delivered them face to face, his tone clipped and his eyes giving away nothing. Johnson and a handful of others, no more than 24 men, were to gear up for a rapid deployment by air. Their destination was pre-surveyed, the officer said, but the coordinates made no sense. The location wasn't on any map Johnson had seen. The aircraft took them deep into the interior, far from Little America Base, and far from the coastal operations that had dominated most of Highjump's official activity. From above, the landscape was the same unbroken expanse of white they'd seen for weeks, until it wasn't. As they approached the drop point, Johnson noticed something unusual: a massive ridge of ice that didn't glisten under the sun like normal snow. Its surface looked dull, almost metallic in its sheen. When they all touched down somewhere, then on, they truly felt how different everything was on this continent. Here, it was noticeably warmer than not quite balmy temperatures, but enough to keep their breaths from freezing up immediately in front of their mouths. Most eerie, however, was the low vibration in the air. So faint it teetered on the edge of being imperceptible, but steady enough for the men to exchange glances. Later, Johnson described it as similar to a far-off machinery hum traveling through the ground rather than through the air. At the bottom of the ridge, they found the source of their orders: a long, narrow fissure in the ice, its ends perfectly clean, as if cut by a huge blade. Around it, the snow had melted in straight, geometric patterns, the random irregularity of natural thawing. Inside, however, the fissure opened into a tunnel. Neither were they pure ice, nor were they rock. They were something intermediate, a smooth, curved material that seemed as ancient as it was engineered. Simple orders, really. Investigate, but do not enter. That rule lasted for less than 10 minutes. Maybe it was curiosity driving one of the officers, or just perhaps he figured the rank entitled him. But in any case, he clipped the safety line to his harness and slipped into the opening. The men outside waited, the minutes stretching into an uneasy silence, until the rope went slack. There was no signal, no movement. The man was gone. Another officer volunteered to go in after him, now firmly binding the safety line to his waist. He slipped into the fissure, and, for a moment, it appeared routine until the line snapped taut, then shook violently. They hauled him back up only to find him conscious, but utterly unresponsive. His eyes were open, staring into nothing, his lips slightly parted, but unmoving. He never spoke another word for the rest of his life. It sufficed for the generals. The problem was the immediate withdrawal of the team. They put themselves back on board the aircraft without collecting samples, without taking measures. Johnson's questions got the long, hard look and such a silence that meant he'd do better to not ask again. And yet, what Johnson guarded next was even more unsettling. Proof that someone had been here long before us. The lost files and manufactured silence. When Operation Highjump ended abruptly in February 1947, months ahead of schedule, it wasn't just the ships and planes that left Antarctica. Something else disappeared, the paper trail. In the weeks that followed, reports that should have been archived simply never arrived at their destinations. Flight logs were incomplete or missing altogether. Reconnaissance photographs vanished in transit. Even personnel rosters for certain assignments came back altered, with entire names quietly removed, as if those men had never set foot on the ice. Robert Johnson didn't realize the scale of the purge until years later, but even at the time, he could sense the deliberate effort to close the curtain. The air aboard the ships had shifted. Conversations were shorter, eyes more guarded. The normal banter that filled mess halls after a mission was replaced with silence or sudden topic changes when the wrong person walked in. The explanation given by everyone back in port was as dry and unconvincing as it could ever be. Severe weather, logistical strain, mission complete. No one wasted an explanation about why an operation designed to last between 6 and 8 months would suddenly pack up and then leave after only slightly more than 8 weeks, during the best time of year for Antarctic mischief. Admiral Byrd would hold one last press conference in South America and disappear for months. In it, he gave an unusual warning. The United States could see a new enemy that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The day that remark was made was one day of headlines and was then quietly buried. Johnson would note later that it was the last time Byrd ever uttered anything like provocative in public. Thereafter, all he talked about was safe subjects like weather and base construction. Pulling the curtain back, cleanup operations turned out to be disappointing. Johnson remembered seeing photographs taken during clear aerial runs images of massive geometric shapes etched into the ice like the tops of buried structures. Some even showed what looked like doors set into sheer ice walls. Those photos were labeled classified and locked away. Within months, they were simply gone. It was not just pictures. Written records about anomalous terrain were either destroyed or kept classified for an indefinite period. Complete incident reports included missing teams in craggy areas from the Navy records. Johnson even knew of one officer who tried to keep personal copies of certain documents. The guy was fired silently and escorted out without even being allowed to pack his bags. In 1959, with Highjump a little over a decade in the past, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. In theory, it was a tremendous example of international cooperation, turning the continent into a peaceful university for scientific research, while forbidding military advancement and resource exploitation. To Johnson, it was something else, a lock on the last door to the truth. "They didn't sign that to protect the penguins," he would remark. "They signed it to make sure nobody else went looking where we'd been." In Johnson's view, the strangest thing about it was how well the treaty had stood. In a world where countries squabbled over every inch of territory, here they all somehow agreed not to touch Antarctica. Decades passed without any serious violations, he said, and to him, that sort of unity was unnatural, given how resource-rich and strategically valuable that place was. Johnson would hold his silence for 78 years, until old age convinced him the truth mattered more than orders. The last man speaks. By the time Robert Johnson reached his 99th birthday, he was more than just a veteran. He was the last surviving link to Admiral Byrd's most controversial expedition. Everyone else who had been there was gone. The stories, the warnings, the unexplained incidents, they lived only in his memory. For decades, he'd obeyed the unwritten rule: don't talk. But now, with no one left to silence and no career left to protect, he decided it was time. He agreed to a single recorded interview, conducted quietly in his Virginia home by a small historical research group. There were no reporters, no bright lights, no sensational framing, just a camera, a microphone, and a man who had carried a secret for 78 years. His voice was weathered but steady, his eyes clear. "I am not here to prove anything at all," he began. "I am here to leave the truth behind." That was pretty much all there was to Johnson's testimony, the wild, alien-filled spectacle that conspiracy sites were hoping for. On the contrary, it was grounded, detailed, and possibly because of all of that, more unsettling. He spoke about what a mission within a mission would sound like, about the humming ridge, the fissure leading into engineered tunnels, and two men lost, one forever, the other into a living silence. Then he painted a picture of how, days later, under the guise of a test, the whole site was wiped off the surface. Bombed out, really. Then he mentioned another mission, one that troubled him even more. As part of a small security detail late in the operation, he had been ordered to guard what he was told was a former weather station embedded in the ice. But it was not what he expected, the crushed metal shacks he had imagined. Instead, what he found was a stairway, perfectly carved, descending into the glacier itself. The steps were smooth, uniform, and constructed of concrete. "I know concrete when I see it," he said flat out. And this definitely wasn't built by any Antarctic research team. They have stayed on watch for 2 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, there arrived an officer who took photographs and attempted to descend. He did not get very far, though. The next day, he was gone, discharged, flown home immediately, and never heard from again. Those photographs never turned up in any archive. The other memory is from the night Admiral Byrd came into the communications tent, his face pale, his hands trembling. He refused to log the flight path he had just completed. "You were there," Byrd told Johnson quietly. "You know what we saw. Never forget it." And then the Admiral walked out, leaving those words hanging in the cold air. When asked if he believed that what they had found was extraterrestrial, Johnson hesitated before mumbling, "I don't know," as if hoping that somehow made it less real. "It could have been something ancient. Maybe we didn't build it. Maybe we just found it. But it wasn't natural, and it wasn't ours." Before his death, Robert Johnson left the world with one warning: what we don't know about Antarctica is far greater than what we do. Do you think the truth has finally been told, or is there more buried beneath the ice? Like, share, and subscribe for more deep investigations. And watch the video on your screen for another story governments wish you'd never hear. When history spoke again, the shockwaves of the 2025 discovery.